Yesterday, Trump got specific about those promised tariffs. He threatened that on day one of his second term, he would enact a 25% tariff on all goods from Canada and Mexico and add an additional 10% tariff on all goods from China. Now, you might remember that tariffs were a central part of Trump's first term. He loved tariffs and trade wars, as he called them, but they did not go well for him. Back then, Trump put tariffs specifically on all imported washing machines. And just as he is doing today, Trump promised that those tariffs on those washing machines would not be paid for by American consumers. But guess what? They were. Despite the fact that the price of washing machines had been declining for years at that point, the year Trump's tariff took effect, the price of washing machines in the U.S. surged, an average of $86 a machine. The American consumer very much paid the price. And now, this week, Trump is declaring that he wants to take that same concept and apply it to the vast majority of everything that America imports. Now, most of America's imports come from Mexico and Canada and China, the three countries that Trump is threatening to tariff. As an example, for years now, the U.S. has imported more crude oil from Canada than it has from the rest of the world combined. So for all of the Trump supporters who claimed one of their biggest issues was how expensive gas got under President Biden, well, buckle your seatbelts, folks, because gas may get a lot more expensive. Speaking of which, Trump's tariffs would likely make your car itself significantly more expensive. One Michigan-based auto industry consultant today told the New York Times the prospect of tariffs is a two-alarm fire for the auto industry. There is probably not a single assembly plant in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Texas that would not immediately be affected by a 25% tariff. Chrysler makes minivans in Canada. Chevy and Ford make pickup trucks in Mexico. Economists say that all of those vehicles and many others would become significantly more expensive if Mr. Trump follows through on his threat. Those higher auto prices would have a significant effect on overall inflation, and higher car prices would probably lead to lower sales and layoffs at auto factories. Factory layoffs. Then there's the impact of Trump's tariffs on the cost of groceries. Mexico and Canada are two of the biggest exporters of fresh fruit and vegetables to the United States. In 2022, Mexico supplied 51% of fresh fruit and 69% of fresh vegetables imported into the U.S., while Canada supplied 2% of fresh fruit and 20% of fresh vegetables. Think about that. A combined 53% of all of our imported fresh fruits and a combined 89% of all of our imported fresh vegetables. 89% of all imported vegetables. That is a lot of vegetables. But I don't know, maybe you're someone who likes the sound of that. Maybe you think the U.S. should grow more of its fruits and vegetables domestically and just stop importing so much. Well, the problem there is that Trump's other signature promise could destroy that option, too. According to the Departments of Labor and Agriculture, nearly half of the nation's nearly 2 million farm workers lack legal status. The same is true of the workforce that makes up our domestic dairy and meat packing industries. Now, I am no professor of economics. Who am I to say that would make American grocery prices skyrocket? Luckily for me, Reuters talked to a food economics and policy professor who told Reuters that mass removal of farm workers would shock the food supply chain and drive consumer grocery prices higher. It's not just grocery bills that will feel the impact of Trump's agenda here. Take housing costs. Not only does the U.S. get the majority of its imported lumber from Canada, which Trump's tariffs would make 25% more expensive, but Trump wants to deport the labor force that builds a gigantic portion of America's housing. This weekend, Texas's construction industry sounded the alarm about just how devastating Trump's promised deportations would be for the industry's capacity to build. The CEO of the construction giant Merrick told NPR it would devastate our industry. We wouldn't finish our highways. We wouldn't finish our schools. Housing would disappear. They'd lose half their labor. Tariffs on their own could devastate our economy. Mass deportation on its own could devastate our economy. And Donald Trump says he wants to do both on day one. Joining me now is Chris Hayes, host of All In. You may recall him from 5 minutes ago. And Faz Shakir, senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and founder and executive director of More Perfect Union. Guys, it's great to have you here.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Yikes, is what I have to say. I mean, the cascade effect is just staggering. When you talk about the most talked about policies, there weren't a lot that Trump sort of heralded on the campaign trail. Mass deportations and tariffs. What's so stunning, Chris, is like he tried, you pointed this out on your show. He tried this once before on soybeans, and it ended up with like subsidies that the American government had to pay the farmers who were the victim of retaliatory tariffs from China.
Yeah, it was basically the worst of all worlds, which is basically China retaliated. I mean, we import a ton from China, as everyone knows. There's a, made in China, it's a cliche. But we also export a lot of things to them, including American farmers. And so they said, okay, we retaliate. They put a tariff on our agricultural exports. Tons of soybean, for instance, just laying fallow. And then you ended basically have this weird situation where he took the revenue from the tariffs and used it to cut welfare checks to American farmers to make them whole. But it's like a lose-lose. Like, okay, well, you've got the money from the tariffs, and now you're just paying people money to not sell the product that they grew.
It's insane.
It's just a terrible. And the other thing about this is, for all the bluster, it wasn't like this experiment he did with, trade war resulted in some rebalancing of America's trade deficit with China or some new terms. It was professional wrestling.
Yeah. It's WWE economic policy.
And it went away. The question here is it going to be that again, which in some ways is weirdly the best case scenario? Or are they really going to drive the car off the cliff?
Well, right.
That's really it.
Living on the precipice is such a morbid fascination of his, right? Maybe because he thinks it connotes strongman vibes. But really, I mean, Faz, if the goal of these punitive tariffs, in the case of China and to some degree Mexico, is to stop the trafficking of drugs over the border, the reality is that 95% of fentanyl seized by U.S. law enforcement is discovered in personal vehicles driven across the border by U.S. citizens. That's according to the DHS. I mean, Faz, this is a solution in search of the problem exists, right? Fentanyl is an issue. But this isn't, I mean, it won't even change the sort of root cause of why he wants to impose these tariffs to begin with.
Right. Well, you're right about the drug problem, and we've been dealing with the fact that, under the Biden administration had been actually, if you look at the actual facts and the statistics of fentanyl moving across the border, had been effectively starting to curb that. So there's that. And then in addition to that, I think if we're talking about tariffs, one thing that I'm honed in on is the idea that we got to fight for American workers. And in his best sense, Donald Trump is trying to at least advocate and articulate that that's a claim of what he's trying to do with tariffs, that if John Deere is going to move plants to Mexico to build tractors, if Stellantis is going to shut down, if Case New Holland is going to move to Mexico as well, that we're going to penalize everything that comes back across. What ends up happening, of course, you don't save those jobs. Those jobs still go over, and now we have nothing for the American worker. And what the Biden administration had been doing is investing in making the cost of starting these businesses attainable and investing from a government perspective in the communities so that both everything, education, housing, all of it worked together seamlessly to raise and lift all boats. But what Donald Trump's proposing is that we just basically lose the proposition that Chris Hayes was just laying out.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is worth his best case scenario politically is people like one of Donald Trump's strengths is that he sees everything zero sum, and I think a lot of voters see things in zero sum. Like we are getting screwed. Someone is screwing us. There's some pie, and someone's taking a big slice. Donald Trump, that's how he views everything, and this kind of rhetoric is extremely useful. So the best case scenario, like I said, is lots of theatrics over it. And he's going back and forth with Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the new president of Mexico, and she wrote him a letter today, and not a lot of stuff happening because the macroeconomic foundation of the country that he's inheriting is in very good shape.
Yes.
And to the extent that he, through ideological commitment or narcissism or whatever, goes through with mass deportation and goes through with huge tariffs, it really will make things worse for people.
Well,
I mean, it's
and
like an
there will
actual
be. You
effect.
have to imagine, Faz, that there will be some political cost. This is a man, Trump, who won voters making between $38,000 and $99,000 a year. These tariffs, which could raise costs on consumers
Gas.
up to $2,500. What's up?
On gas,
On gas, like the most basic, sort of articulations of like how you're doing, how much you have to pay at the grocery store, whether you can afford to feed your family, whether you can take a road trip, whether you can afford the gas to get to your job. I mean, that would all be affected. I mean, that is, I guess, the insurance policy here is it would crater Trump's support among the very voters that supported him.
Well, let me first offer one of the reasons why he's moving in this direction, tariffs and deportation, is because it's a unique power afforded to the president. It's in some sense, it's the cheapest and easiest way out. Instead of having to negotiate with Congress or and figure out a tax proposal that would penalize corporations who are wrongly offshoring jobs, that would be a hard thing to do. We get into the tax code and figure out how to best levy a penalty on a corporation that does illegal actions. He's going to go for a tariff, which is a blunt force mechanism that he has, which is really an awful way to try to address this problem. But I just want to be clear why he's doing it, because he's not going the harder route to build a coalition and actually address this problem through a lot of different dimensions, right? You could do immigration policy this way, tax policy, whole series of actions that you could move through Congress if you wanted to be a leader on this and restructure our American economy to make sure, to the point that he's trying to raise, penalizing bad actors. Well, that we could agree on, but here's the Democratic Party has been trying to fight on, you name it, stock buybacks, dividends, corporate rates, loopholes in the corporate IRS auditing people. But these are all the things the Republicans have been trying to undermine for all the past couple of years.